The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Business Inspections and Zoning Committee will now begin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Business Inspections and Zoning Committee for July 21st. I'm Lisa Goodman and I am chairing the committee today. As we begin, I'll note for the record this meeting has remote participation from members of the City Council and City staff as authorized by Minnesota State Statute 13D.021 due to the declared public health local emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll so we can verify a quorum for this meeting.
Councilmember Reich?
Present.
Gordon?
Here.
Fletcher?
Here.
Ellison? Schrader?
Here.
Chair Goodman?
Present.
Councilmember Ellison is absent at this time. There are 5 members present.
Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. The agenda for today's meeting is in front of us. We'll first take up the consent agenda, which is items 3 through 13. Item 3 is setting a public hearing for the next meeting on August 4th to consider a business subsidy agreement with Northgate Development. Item 4 is a local district designation for the Lyndhurst Residential Historic District. Items 5 through 9 are all rezoning applications submitted for properties located at 2911 Grand Street Northeast, 2641 Fremont Avenue South, 1127 4th Street Southeast, 411 12th Avenue Southeast, 1820 Girard Avenue South, and 3136 Minnehaha Avenue as listed on the agenda. Item 10 is an alley vacation submitted for 461 Girard Terrace. And items 11 through 13 are referrals to staff for ordinances related to the regulation of off-street parking and travel demand management and the regulation of rooming houses and congregate living facilities. Are there any comments on the consent agenda, or would anyone like to pull anything off for discussion? And please feel free, members of the committee, to note if you'd like to speak in the chat function. Seeing no items to be pulled, I'll move the consent agenda, items 3 through 13, and ask the clerk to call the roll.
Councilmember Reich?
Aye.
Gordon?
Aye.
Fletcher?
Aye.
Ellison? Schrader?
Aye.
Chair Goodman?
Aye.
Councilmember Ellison? There are 5 ayes.
Those items are approved. We'll move on to our quasi-judicial public hearings, starting with item number 1. Item number 1 is an appeal submitted by Michael Rattle and Robert Van Nelson regarding the decision of the Heritage Preservation Commission to approve a certificate of appropriateness for the historic variance for Joyce Memorial Methodist Church, a historic landmark located at 1219 West 31st. I'll recognize Rob from our Community Planning and Economic Development Department to give that presentation. Staff might have to press something to get logged in.
Thank you, Councilmember. Good afternoon, Council members. My name is Rob Skalecki. I'm a city planner in the Historic Preservation section of CPED. Today I'm presenting an appeal application submitted by Michael Riddell and Robert Van Nelson of the June 23rd, 2020 Heritage Preservation Commission's approval of a certificate of appropriateness application for rehabilitation and a historic variance to allow for a 34-unit multiple family dwelling on an R2B parcel located at the Joyce Memorial Methodist Church, 1219 West 31st Street in the South Uptown neighborhood. Next slide, please. The Joyce Memorial Methodist Church was designated as a City of Minneapolis landmark in May 2020. The property is significant for architecture as the best example of a California Mission Revival style church in the city, and the work of master architects Downs and Eads. The property was constructed in 1907 and retains good integrity. The building features clay hip roof segments, mission style parapets, stair and bell towers, deep arch entryways, and window openings and quatrefoil windows. All of these are characteristic, character defining elements of the California Mission Revival style. Next slide, please. The applicant has proposed to rehabilitate the church and reuse the building as a 34-unit apartment. The applicant submitted a certificate of appropriateness and historic variance application to allow the rehabilitation of the building, including the restoration of characteristic historic features, including but not limited to the clay tile roof and all existing historic windows, also the property's stained glass windows. The applicant proposed minimal alterations to the primary north and west street facing elevations and proposed the majority of new window openings to accommodate the dwelling units on the south and east non-primary elevations. The HPC expressed support of the project's variance, expressing that historic church buildings are generally difficult to reuse. The commission voted that the variance is appropriate and the exterior alterations made to accommodate the proposed reuse are appropriate. Next slide, please. Staff has also included in the application floor plans, the staff has included from the application floor plans in this presentation to reference for the proposed 34-unit layout. If you would go to the next slide, please. On June 23rd, 2020, the Minneapolis HPC heard the Certificate of Appropriateness and Historic Variance applications for the rehabilitation and reuse of the subject property. In concurrence with staff recommendations, the commission voted to approve the Certificate of Appropriateness application to allow for the exterior rehabilitation of Joyce Memorial Methodist Church, subject to design considerations related to new window openings, as well as the interpretation of historic openings. And the HPC approved the historic variance to allow for a 34-unit multiple family dwelling apartment on an R2B zoned parcel. I'm available for any questions if you have any. As I said, the remaining floor plans are included in this presentation for reference too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your report. I'll first see if there are any questions for staff or members of the committee. Anyone? Okay, seeing none, we will go ahead and proceed to opening the public hearing. With this type of hearing, we give the applicant an opportunity to appellant to make their case first. Is Michael Riddell or Robert Van Nelson on the line? I hear from staff they are on the line. And so I will afford you each the opportunity to address the committee in whatever order you'd like.
Okay. Hello. Thank you. Just check, can the committee hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Just state your name and address for the record, sir.
Okay. Yes. So I am Robert Van Nelson. I am at 1215 West 31st Street, the property directly to the east of the Joyce Church. And I'll be speaking on behalf of, in terms of just simplicity and maybe efficiency of time, to the main concerns that Michael Radel and I have in regards to the variance that was granted. I had shared with the committee PowerPoint. I was hoping if it could be brought up to the second slide, please. So in anticipation of that, I'd just like to set a little bit of context. I've been living at this residence for over 20 years. I'm an advocate and proponent for urban development and the goals of the 2040 plan. I have a background in architecture and have worked in community development, both in the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Fridley HRA. So I can say in general, I appreciate the developer's intent and the committee's intent to look for creative solutions to reuse both interesting buildings in the neighborhood and work on creating a vibrant neighborhood. But that said, there are some specific concerns that we saw specifically in relation to policy 37 in terms of how we think about making these data-driven decisions as a community and as a city. I have a number of slides and information to be incorporated, but in the interest of time, I'd like to just focus on what our objective is to really find a better way of utilizing this project based on some concerns. If you could advance to slide 6, please, then we'll just jump ahead. Hopefully it's visible. So the staff had talked about the historic designation as identified by HPC, and then the second step of looking towards approving a 34-unit variance. Our concerns are really around the process and the amount of information and data that was presented to the committee to support that, as well as the evaluation of the proposal. Though the materials numbered in hundreds of pages, there was really no information around a market analysis, no estimate of costs, no targeting of a rent, no real description as to the analysis that suggested a 34-unit property was required. So if you could advance to the slide 7, please. The only data that was provided was a reference to an article, 2 references to a single article in the Atlantic that identified 6,000 to 10,000 churches dying each year in America, and that's certainly dramatic and would be concerning and would support the difficulties of renovating that property. However, looking into those details, that actual article, that data had a hyperlink to a Facts and Trends webpage that a staff could advance to slide 7, please. That article, in fact, seemed to take a tenor that was much more oriented around the revitalization of the ministry or the objectives of churches. And actually, if staff could advance to slide 9, the article had a note at the bottom saying that a previous version had erroneously stated that substantial number, and in fact, there were only 3,700 churches that were closed. So again, that sounds concerning, but when looking further through that particular reference or citation, if you could go to slide 10, please. That article then is explicitly talking about the organization of ministry and churches, and in fact presents a counterfactual argument in that over 4,000 new church organizations were created in the year that they cited the 3,700 being closed. So if staff could advance to slide 11. The objective isn't really to kind of drill into and try to play a got you element around this analysis, but it's really trying to look at how we're making a case, or what is the result of saying that we need to develop a 34 unit on that property. You know, I think as a neighborhood, we're sympathetic and appreciate the goal to increase housing, increase the affordability of housing, increase the uniqueness of facilities. But it just feels like the process was rushed to a preset objective, and I'd like to really focus on the data and the implications of that choice. So if you could advance to slide 12, just to illustrate when we accept the premise that the structure needs to have 34 units, the things that don't immediately jump out from the materials, but when you look at them, you can see the project demolishes the entirety of the sanctuary and balcony space, something characteristic of the space. More importantly, though, 30% of the units are in the basement. So 10 of the 34 units are in a basement in a building that has some moisture considerations. And furthermore, those units, 70% of those face out onto either an alley, directly adjacent the neighbor's garage, less than 5 feet from the windows, or the neighbor's direct property, or the neighbor's windows in his house, or a structural ramp that's put in to make it accessible. There also hasn't been any consideration or explanation as to what the target market, and we're really looking for some type of transparency as to what is the affordability of the unit. Is it targeted? Are the rents comparable to other available options in the neighborhood? And then other specific items from these choices, if we accept it needs to be 34 units, it puts the garbage bins for 34 housing units within 17 feet or less than 15 feet to the front sidewalk, which is the main pedestrian way in the uptown area. It will be visually obstructed to a degree based on the plans, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the smells can be contained by the structure. And additionally, any type of structure that obscures it sufficiently enough will create a safety element as it's a dark space already, and it would be an opaque object off an alleyway that is already fairly frequented by restroom users after bar time. The other concerns is those choices then sacrifice a lot of amenities or public space that would be offered and are offered by other developments in the area that have the same micro unit concept. So this isn't a summary of everything that every building has, but several of them have, or most of them have at least half of them, things like common spaces, common living rooms, kitchens that can be rented, all of the things that make the trade-off of a micro unit attractive to the segments that look there. No yoga studios, exercise facilities, meeting rooms to facilitate work from home, which has become increasingly important in the current COVID environment that we're in. Bike space. There's really no addressing any type of transportation or commuting beyond a 228 square foot basement storage space that needs to go downstairs and would not accommodate any material amount of biking. You know, a comparable project on 610 or 601 West Lake Street, micro unit development of 46 units, has essentially one parking space per unit to accommodate that transportation. So those are just considerations that are specifically excluded when it comes to renting and the sustainable viability of the development. I'd be concerned of how it would compete for renters. If staff could advance to slide 13. And just quickly, it's kind of a visualization of just how close that garbage is to both the primary walkway and my house, the neighbor's house, in full disclosure. Again, it may be visually covered, but I don't think the sense will be addressed. If you could advance to slide 14. Just wanted to talk about then its congruence with the small area plan for Uptown. Density as proposed would put it at over 120 units per acre, which is higher than the highest density targeted area in the area plan. And that area has been kind of clearly defined as a particular stretch of housing closer to Lake Street and Lagoon Street corridor. I understand that lines have to be drawn somewhere, and there's some practicality in looking at it as a unique structure. So maybe it's not necessarily a single family house or the current rating. That makes a ton of sense. It should be higher density in some regard, but we should think about that density and the choices that are required to support that. Additionally, at the Historic Preservation Committee, there was a significant opposition to the development as drawn. So you could advance to slide 15. Over 75% of the households as identified had expressed concern about the project and had signed on to the initial submittal at the HPC. I can say qualitative, there is a lot of support from the neighbors for development, and if anything, there's more interest in getting more information as to, is it targeting affordability? Will it help address the diversity of the housing stock in the city? And what are those trade-offs? So I think there's receptivity and support from the neighborhood for something out of the norm, but the question is really, what are the trade-offs that are being made currently, and if there's an opportunity for the city council or the zoning committee to improve it. If you could advance to slide 16. That's really the nature of the petition of the appeal, is to really ask the zoning committee to contemplate the design decisions that were required based on the current zoning, and what opportunities that we have to maybe revisit that conversation, be it from either a minor reduction in the amount of units or additional ancillary requirements to make it more of a sustainable project in the future. And with that, we can advance to slide 17. And I'd like to extend my appreciation to the committee for listening to the appeal and contemplating, and be happy to answer any further questions that there may be from discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Van Nelson, thank you for your presentation. In the interest of disclosure, we pretty much didn't see it. So we've been flopping around from slide to slide with no connection to your comments at all. So I'm a little bit confused. I want to see if you're the only person who's speaking. With regard to the appeal, and then I'll ask my questions or just offer anyone else who is speaking on behalf of the appeal if they'd like to speak first.
I think for efficiency, Michael and I had coordinated that I could be the point to answer any questions.
Okay.
He certainly supports all of the efforts, and I believe is in the queue if there's anything that he would like to add. But
Okay.
Welcome the committee's
All right.
questions.
So I just have a few questions for staff before the applicant speaks. Rob, are you still there?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what I understand it's R2B zoning in the current plan, but what is the 2040 plan guidance?
For this
site.
area in particular, so the property itself is, of course, R2B, but it's nearby transit corridors of Hennepin Avenue as well as Lake Street.
What is
Lake Street
what is the
being north.
specific site in the 2040 plan for this site?
For R2B, you're saying? Off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure.
Did we not analyze what the 2040 plan guidance would be on this site prior to issuing a variance?
Chair Goodman, this is Interior 2 in Minneapolis 2040. That's the reason they've chosen to go the route of the historic variance, is because staff would not be able to support a rezoning to allow this density as of right. The historic variance allows for adaptive reuse of existing structures by retaining the historic integrity of those structures, and is a different set of findings than we would use for a land use application under the zoning code. So a historic variance allows for more flexibility in the spirit of adaptive reuse of historic structures. So that's the only path forward for this particular property to achieve the number of dwelling units is the application before you.
Okay, so Ms. Holeen, thank you for that. So essentially it's like a workaround. So it's zoned R2B, the guidance is Interior 2. They want 34 units, which would probably be, unlike a city-sized lot. I can see why the neighbor next door would be upset if you were next to in an R2B guided for Interior 2, and all of a sudden they're talking about, 5 times plus the number of units in this location. I'm empathetic with regard to preservation, but this might just be a reach. Was there a discussion about conformance with any kind of surrounding zoning? I mean, we would never even let anyone in the current 2040 plan go above one zoning corridor, one zoning criteria higher without a comp plan amendment. So I can see why they would be upset.
That's correct. So there are 2 findings for historic variance. So the first is that the variance is compatible with the preservation of the property and with other properties in the area. And then the second is that the variance is necessary to alleviate practical difficulties due to special conditions or circumstances unique to the property and not created by the applicant.
So Ms. Holeen, why couldn't they have 10 units? That would probably be, 3 times what would be allowed under the current zoning. How did we come up with 30-something units?
That's what was proposed by the applicant. So yes, there's certainly other I'm not an architect who's looked at the floor plans of the existing structure, but I'm sure there are other potential ways to lay out units in the building that would result in a different unit count. The applicant could maybe speak to that.
Thank you, Ms. Helene, would we be willing to just simply say, if they came in and said, well, economically we can't do it unless we get 60 units, is there a number at which staff would say would not be consistent with R2 and Interior 2 zoning?
Yeah, so we're looking under the preservation ordinance with these applications. So at a certain point, we do have to start thinking about what potential offsite impacts would be when you're evaluating the number of dwelling units in the structure. In the case where dwelling units are being established within an existing building, though, we're not evaluating things like bulk and height and setbacks because the structure is existing.
Okay, well, it seems like a giant density loophole. And I really would love to preserve any historic building we could, but there has to be a number between 2 and 34. that could be better supported in this location. It sounds like staff really did not analyze the density. It was just purely people on the Heritage Preservation Commission saying, oh, they need 30 something. Okay, 30 something's good with us. Is that correct?
Yeah, the preservation ordinance is unique in that financial considerations can be taken into account with adaptive reuse of structures, as well as evaluating financial considerations for whether or not a building is beyond the point of repair for a designation. So it is more unique that way than the zoning code is.
Okay. I just want to see if there's any other questions for the appellants. If not, I see Megan Elliott is online, and I don't really think any of the questions have to do with whether or not this is a historic structure, but I certainly would invite her to speak if there are no other questions. Megan, feel free to go ahead, and you can be followed by Mr. Margulies. So I just want to confirm that anyone on the development side is welcome to speak.
So this is Mike Riddell. Can you hear me?
Mike Riddell, are you with Robert Van Nelson on that side, on the side of the appeal?
I am, and I just wanted to clarify and add to what Robert and what you had been discussing about the number of units. I don't know if I jumped in too soon here. I can wait for the
we gave you an opportunity during the appellant side and no one else said anything, so I was moving on to the other side. Do you have anything? I don't want to have a back and forth with me. I just want you to present your side, which I think you guys did.
Absolutely. Could I have just 1 minute? I just have a couple of things I'd like to mention.
Sure.
So this is Mike Riddell. I'm at 3109 Fremont. I'm the property to the south of the proposed rehabilitation of the church. One of the things I'm not sure that has been mentioned or that the committee is aware of, there were long discussions going back to 2018 and 2019 with Brian regarding what his proposed original project would be, which would have been 10 to 15 units. And he had support from the neighbors under that plan. It wasn't until just recently in March that changed, and there was no community engagement on that change. So I just want to add that in as part of some of the history along with this appeal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll go ahead and ask the developer side if they're on the line, which I believe they are, and if you would like to speak to this.
Good afternoon, council members and Chair Goodman. This is Megan Elliott. Are you able to hear me?
We are, thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much for hearing this item today. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to myself, and I will be representing the team today, the development team. Again, this is Megan Elliott. I'm with New History. We're a Minneapolis-based consulting team. We are exclusively and solely dedicated to increasing the use and reuse of our existing and historic sites and structures. And certainly this Joyce Memorial Church is exactly the type of building we try to find creative solutions for reuse. Likewise, we work with places and spaces like PD Plaza, the Dayton Department Store, the Hollywood Theater, among others here in Minneapolis. So just a really brief 1-minute overview of how we got to where we are today. And hopefully to answer some of the questions, Chair Goodman, that you were bringing up earlier. To be frank, when we started this project, Brian's goal and his initial plan was to demolish the building. It wasn't an easy project to make it work, and we've been working with Brian for the last couple of years. We did work with city staff to, I think the word workaround was used, but that's exactly what we tried to do, was to find a way that we could reuse this building, keep it in place as a community resource, knowing that bar none, community churches are probably the hardest building type to reuse. They're the hardest building type to reuse, but I think we could hopefully all agree that they're an important resource in the community to retain as part of our built heritage. I had previously worked on the building on behalf of the Methodist Church, walked through with a couple of groups, tried to find a different solution for the project, and this is probably dating back to 2015. And then until I connected with Brian in 2018, that we started looking at a housing option for a way of reusing the building. Like I said, the initial plan was demo. We did work with staff. We looked at a lot of different options, including rezoning, and decided that the only chance we had at making this work was to go down the path of local historic designation and then using a historic variance to, again, find a creative way of keeping this building, I'll use the word alive. This is the only time in my consulting career that I've had a developer willingly nominate a building for local designation. I think most people run from that as fast as they can, but again, this was the way we could get this, find a use for the building. So we did. Brian nominated the building. We had support from city staff. We had support from the HPC. We had support from the State Historic Preservation Office and of course City Council. My office authored the nomination, and as Rob said, for its architecture, specifically the exterior architecture. With the nomination, we were able to apply for the certificate of appropriateness for the reuse, as well as for the historic variance. We developed the design in consultation with city staff, as well as with the architects, DJR, Brian, of course, my office. I think there was a question earlier about the number of units. The number of units was related to how we could offset the cost of reuse, which came from maximizing the number of units that we could fit within the existing envelope of the building while making minimum changes to the exterior of the building. Keeping in mind that the Heritage Preservation Commission, as well as the local designation, is for the exterior only, not for the interior, not for the sanctuary. The appellant did mention that Brian had initially planned on 10 to 15 units. That is true. We spent a lot of time trying to find a reuse for the sanctuary that would keep it open. I can't speak to all of the efforts that Brian went through, but I do know that there was a period of time where we were trying to work with a performing arts group, several nonprofit organizations, even what I'll call some shared co-working space type options, none of which we could get to the table in time to keep this building. And so we moved forward with a housing reuse. And then it was working with DJR, the architects, to fit the units in a way that we could retain as much of the historic material at the interior as possible. But again, noting that it's the exterior that's particularly notable from a preservation perspective. We did recently, as Rob noted, go to the HPC. The HPC did unanimously agree or approve of both the historic variance and the certificate of appropriateness. I would say, from my perspective, as a consultant working with these buildings, these are extremely difficult building types to reuse, i.e. a church. This is one of the few successful uses I've seen of a church, perhaps the only one I've seen in my time as a consultant. And I think that this is one of the occasions that I can say that I think our preservation ordinance did what it was supposed to do, which was allowing us to retain this building. And the historic variance recognized the extreme hardship with reusing these resources. And I think without it, and without this variance, I don't think that this building will be reused. And I think there's still a high likelihood of demolition without the support of the variance and the historic certificate of appropriateness as currently designed. I am available to answer questions. I will be, I'll be honest that I can speak more to the preservation aspect of this than to the density aspects.
Thank you, Megan, for your comments. I'll see if there's any questions from anyone from the committee, for you.
Okay.
Seeing none, is the developer on the line?
No, I'm representing Brian Farrell today.
So how are we supposed to ask him questions about the density if he's not on the line?
I'm sorry?
How are we supposed to be asking him questions with regard to the density variance if he's not here? So
I think, and I would actually maybe go back to staff. in terms of, I'll do my best to answer the question, which is we looked at the historic variance as the single tool to keep the building in use, and the findings required for the historic variance are such that the building is, or the changes are compatible with the preservation requirements, which I believe it is, and that they are required to offset unique circumstances, which I think reusing a church for a non-assembly use, I think it is a unique hardship, and therefore, again, it's not a specific density answer, but it is the preservation answer.
So the developer didn't think it was that big of a deal to be on the call today, is the long and short of that.
Chair Goodman? Chair
Yes.
Goodman? This is Michael Margulies. I'm speaking on behalf of the developer today.
Are you the developer
Valerian.
or are you the architect?
I am the project developer for Mr. Farrell. He could not be on the line today, but we are performing development services for him.
Okay, well, you're signed up to testify, so absolutely testify.
Okay.
Please just state your name and address for the record.
My name is Michael Margulies, 2007 West Franklin in Minneapolis. If I can address the question of the density, I think Megan did a good job explaining the dilemma that we faced. And as Ms. Hoyland suggested, we followed the rules that the city has imposed to try and sustain this building. In terms of the number of units, we have to make it work so that the development cost is somewhat matched by whatever revenue we can produce. The development costs for a reuse of a building of this type are pretty significant, and the number of units reflects both what we think is an appropriate use of the building, but also in terms of the financial balance in order to both provide enough units to make it economically feasible and keep the rents at an approachable entry-level price. These are not going to be expensive units. They're going to serve a neighborhood need. So it's a tough balancing act, and as was presented earlier, the financial aspects are allowed to be considered as part of the rules that were imposed upon us.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions for Mr. Margulies? Thank you then, sir. There are no questions.
Thank you.
I'll see if there's anyone else signed up on the line to testify on either one of these issues, or if there are, and let's see if that's happening first. And then we'll go ahead and close the public hearing, seeing that there's no additional people signed up to testify, and ask if there's any questions for staff. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just had a quick question for the city attorney, just to get some clarity on what is our decision today. Like, we had a discussion about, like, we had on kind of the density of the building and how it would fit in with kind of the future plans with 2040, but this seems to be just a decision on the certificate of appropriateness. And so I just kind of wanted to get some clarity for the council, the committee members, just to say, what are we deciding and kind of what is in the bounds of what we're making decision on today.
Thank you, committee members. This is Joel Fussy with the City Attorney's Office. And I also will defer to staff a bit on this, but there are two matters before you. Obviously, the first is the certificate of appropriateness, and the second is the rezoning. The certificate of appropriateness, the elements are laid out, although I do believe the fifth element does include within it at least reference to the comp plan. And so I would defer to Ms. Holeen, but I think that compatibility with the comp plan and general density could be part of that analysis, although I would note that it does not appear to be explicitly part of the variance analysis, which is limited to the 2-element test that was described by staff earlier.
Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you. But yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to kind of follow up with the city attorney on the rezoning question. Is that, how does that kind of factor in?
Madam Chair and committee members, Mr. Fussy speaking here again. The staff report talks about the two elements that need to be examined for the historic variance, and those reference to the compatibility with the preservation of the property and with other properties in the area, and necessary to alleviate practical difficulties due to special conditions or circumstances. I'm not uniquely familiar with this property, but I'm sure staff can, further explain their reasoning in that matter.
Okay, thank you. I don't know that I have a follow-up question on that, but I do have a question for Ms. Hulin or other staff. Just back to kind of your questions, Madam Chair, about the number of units. If we could get a little kind of clarity, I mean, it seems that the issue was the developer cannot do the preservation without having this number of units, and just wanted to have a little bit better understanding of how that analysis was done by staff. I thought the chair made a very good point about the amount of density being higher than other places that higher than it might be allowed under 2040. But I think we need to balance that with the need to preserve the building. So I'm trying to get a little more clarity on how kind of staff looks at that balance.
Ms. Hulin.
Sure, I was waiting to see if Rob wanted to take that one. So in situations like this, like I said, with the preservation application, we have two applications before you. So the certificate of appropriateness is really more about the physical changes to the structure. If this were all interior, we wouldn't be looking at a certificate of appropriateness, but that there are some exterior modifications to make the building accessible and bring it up to code for residential uses. So that's why you're seeing that. Along with the certificate of appropriateness, that type of investment into the building in order to convert it to residential, of course, does come with an expense on the part of the developer. I don't know that we looked at it at a staff level and said, well, we're financial experts here, so we think that you could do 15 units and get by, or 20. I do know the project did evolve over time from when the applicant first brought it to staff, just with general zoning questions about whether or not a number of units beyond 2 or 3 would be permitted in the church. And with the Interior 2 designation in 2040, we weren't able to get to a rezoning that would allow for more than 3 units here. Of course, that Interior 2 is in the built form, where we're looking at things like bulk, height, the built form of the building, which is already set in this instance. So the built form here with the preservation of the building is what it is. So the number of units is really then an interior calculation about what can be accommodated within the building. And, I don't think that we necessarily gave feedback on, we think one certain number of units would be better than another. We just responded to the application that was presented to us.
Did that answer? Yeah, I just wanted to see if that answered your questions, Councilmember Schrader.
It did, and I'll just make a comment and just kind of to finish up. I really appreciate staff's kind of input into this. This is a harder question because we really try to make 2040 be the guiding vision. For me, what I really think is important is preserving this historic building, and being that it's an existing building, I think I will not be supporting the appeal. I think the question of the density is a good one, but here it's an existing building already. It sounds like the developer has done a lot of work to make sure that they can preserve the historic structure.
Are there other comments or questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, is there a motion anyone would like to make?
Madam Chair?
Sir.
I would like to move to deny the appeal.
So we have a motion in front of us to deny the appeal. Are there comments or questions anyone would like to make? Then I just have a few comments I would like to make about it. I have a building in the ward that I represent that is a historic home on the MCTC campus. And in order to save it, there were a lot of trade-offs. And the building is not that big. It's probably about the size of this church. And they had to put 20+ units in it in order to make it work as well. And I think we felt overall that it made sense to save this beautiful historic building, which Megan Elliott helped us on actually, I think that it was a good trade-off. Of course, it was a neighborhood that had a lot of density. This is also a neighborhood that has a lot of density. And it seems to me as though the historic variance does not really look at or analyze the overall costs. We have to, in a way, believe the people who are doing the work. For me, saving the historic building would be the top #1 thing. And quite frankly, the developer could have put in 15 4-bedroom units. I mean, they're going to use the space they have. And so what they're saying is they probably can generate more revenue to help with the preservation of the building and make a profit that they're entitled to make by putting in more units and having them be smaller than putting in less units, having them be bigger, but potentially having the same number of people. Because they could be in front of us asking for less units, more bedrooms. In the end, you'd still have the same number of people because they're going to use whatever space they can. And so for that reason, I do see this as a loophole as it pertains to density. But as the author of the historic use variance that went through many, many years ago, which has very rarely been used, it seems to me as though the trade-off is worth it for the preservation of the building. Although the applicants might prefer to see a demolition and a new building that could include garbage and could include some of the amenities that would be common in the area, I think overall the preservation of the building is the most important thing, and sometimes we have to make compromises in order to make that happen. So I will be supporting Councilmember Schrader's motion with reservations and an understanding that preservation is the guiding principle here. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, I'd ask the clerk to call the roll.
Chair, this is the applicant. Do I have an opportunity to ask one
No,
more question?
I'm sorry, sir. The public hearing is closed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Councilmember Reich,
Aye.
Gordon,
Aye.
Fletcher,
Aye.
Ellison,
Aye.
Schrader,
Aye.
Chair Goodman.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
That item is approved, which means the appeal has not prevailed. And this will be forwarded to the City Council meeting on a week from Friday. We'll now move on to item number 2, which is consideration of an appeal submitted by Max Ellison on behalf of South Uptown Neighborhood Association regarding the approval of several decisions of the Planning Commission to allow for the retention of a 1-story commercial building and the construction of a 5-story building addition with commercial space and 74 apartments for properties located at 3501, 3525 Hennepin Avenue. And I will recognize Aaron Hanauer from CPED to give that presentation.
Thank you, Chair Goodman. And I'll see if the slides are ready to accompany. Let's see here. And I can also get going here. So June 15th, the City Planning Commission approved all the applications that they have purview over and recommended to the City Council the approving of the rezoning applications, and that's further down on today's agenda. Max Ellis, as you noted, Councilmember Goodman, on behalf of the South Uptown Neighborhood Association, appealed the following Planning Commission decisions: that conditional use permit for height, variances to reduce yard requirements, variance to increase building lot coverage and impervious surface, as well as site plan review. Reason for the appeal in the first paragraph: the project is out of character with the guidance described in Minneapolis 2040. And then they go on for more detail in their appeal. So just brief background: 6 parcels, as you noted, Chair Goodman, at the southeast corner of 35th and Hennepin. It is a unique property containing that charming building that is considered a historic resource. They have 2 front yards, one in Hennepin and one in 35th, an abnormal rear yard situation. They have a dead end alley, property line that jogs at the south portion of the site, and then also there's a portion of the subject property that provides access to a neighboring property's garage along Girard Avenue. The next slide, please. So the area is a mix of buildings and zoning. Along to the east is primarily residential, low density, and early 20th century apartment buildings. Along Hennepin, a mix of commercial, such as the Uptown Vision Clinic to the south, the mixed-use Hummingbird building, the new development just to the north, and a wide range of residential, from duplexes to a 70-unit greenhouse apartment building at 3540 Hennepin Avenue. And also note the grading does slope considerably to the east and to the south. So as you highlighted in the beginning, Councilmember Goodman, that mixed-use development, I'll go to the next, if you could go to the next slide, please. Retaining that historic building or that potential historic resource at the corner, adding a little commercial space, 1,400 square feet, and then adding 74 residential units. Next slide, please. There are positives, and there's a lot of positives and support for this project from a comp plan and zoning code standpoint. Recognize that there are more applications than typical, but the unique circumstances exist. As it noted, a reverse corner lot, retaining a historic building at the intersection, and an abnormal rear yard lot configuration. And also just looking at the comp plan guidance, corridor 4, it's at Hennepin Avenue Goods and Services corridor, and neighborhood mixed use. Also note a lot of positives from a comprehensive plan standpoint, a pedestrian-friendly design with removing 2 curb cuts and adding a number of entrances, pedestrian entrances along Hennepin Avenue, constructing a mixed-use building along a goods and services corridor, replacing surface parking with enclosed parking, improving stormwater runoff, and designing to fit in with the area with the additional height. This can be seen with the E-shaped building design, the courtyards along Hennepin, not having a long continuous building wall as you often see, multiple upper floor setbacks, more glass on the 5th floor to increase the transparency of that tallest portion of the building, and designing those upper floors to meet the rear and side yard setbacks. The project does need those setbacks for the building, but those upper floors are in compliance with the 15-foot setbacks. And then next slide, please. Just they stepped the building back. Another thing, element along 35th Street, just stepping the building back down to be in relation to that residential building just to the east. So with all that, CPED is supportive of all the applications that were applied for. And I'll note that a few other public comments came in support of the project with your addendum packet, in addition to all the other comments came in with the Planning Commission review.
Are there any questions for Aaron on his report? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to invite Mr. Ellis, who is the main primary appellant, to speak, and then everyone else who is on the appellant side will be asked to speak after that.
Actually, this is Scott Engel. I'm the executive coordinator for the South Uptown Neighborhood Association, and I had contacted Mr. Hanauer. I would speak first, and then Maxine Ellis will speak second. She's the board president, just to clarify. So
that would be wonderful. It's written in my notes as Max, so I'm so sorry to Ms. Ellis.
Yeah, that's just fine.
Mr. Engel, feel free to speak first.
Yes, okay. So there was a document that I sent, a 4-page document. I don't know if that's brought up or not, but I wanted to mention, I'm going to go through a few things, but there's 2 pieces to this. This site is just the wrong spot for this particular design, and we'll go through that later. Also, there were a lot of errors in the staff report and technical issues with the process, including the Planning Commission meeting, that caused concern as well. So the first page, or first slide of the proposal should show the existing site that you just saw from Mr. Hanauer. I will reiterate that this is 6 lots long. This is a half of a block long building. So they're preserving the corner building, which has lots of character. The second photo on the first slide is a photo of the homes on the Girard frontage. They're across the alley and down the hill. Obviously, these are smaller, low-density homes. The Hennepin elevation is now going to be a corridor 4 planning guidance. The planning guidance for Girard, the 3500 block, will be interior 2. The third photo shows 35th Street, and you'll see kind of that there's a hill going on. And then the fourth photo shows the hill up from Girard to Hennepin. And this is the important thing. This is what makes this site unusual, and which did not get mentioned in enough detail by Mr. Hanauer in the staff report or to you just now. The grade difference between Hennepin Avenue and Girard is 25 feet. So it's an unusual site for Minneapolis. So what is happening here is the measurements for the building are all being taken from the Hennepin elevation, which is around 10 feet taller than the alley elevation. So when we talk about a 59-foot building, it's actually 69 feet at the alley elevation. So I want you to keep that in mind. So the second page of the slide shows the proposed design, and it's very pretty, and it preserves the corner building. As you notice, there's the courtyards that were mentioned. It's 3 stories. It fits in with the surrounding buildings. The South Uptown Neighborhood Association, we supported the building at 35th and Hennepin just a few years back at the Hummingbird building. That's a 3-story building. It's beautiful. It fits in. It doesn't loom over its neighbors. It's 1 lot wide. We also supported the building at 32nd in Hennepin, which was developed just a few years back by the Lander Group itself. And that one is actually 4 stories. And that, once again, is wonderful. The neighbors like it. It fits in the context of the neighborhood. The problem with the proposed building is it's stepping up rather than stepping down from the commercial corridor. And the grade change exacerbates that, the height. So when we're talking about a 5-story building, it's actually 6 stories along the alley elevation. And that just seemed to not be communicated very well in the staff report. And I don't think it was clear to the Planning Commission. So, yeah, I mentioned that the Corridor 4 is the new planning guidance for the corridor, or the 3500 Hennepin, or 3501 Hennepin. We understand, as a neighborhood association, we support density. We're a dense neighborhood. It's this particular development is just going to loom over the neighbors. It will put the negative externalities of blocking light and air. If you go to the third slide, you will see the designs from the developer's plans. It's a more than 200-foot long wall along the alley. And at points it goes up to 69 feet, which because it's measured from the Hennepin vantage, or from the Hennepin elevation, it's only considered 5 stories, but some people would consider 70 feet 7 stories. So it's too massive along the back end. And so I think we'd like you to consider, as city council members, is this what you had in mind when you approved Corridor 4 in the 2040 plan? Previously, up until January 1st, the planning guidance was for 2.5 stories along this section of Hennepin. We understand, and it's fine that it's now changed to 4 stories as planning guidance. This particular site with this grade change, it just seems inappropriate. And I think what we fear is we have a tiny little neighborhood with a lot of people in it. We're very dense, but we have 3 Corridor 4 streets. We have Hennepin, Bryant and Lindale Avenues, as well as a corridor 6th Street, Lake Street. And I think the reason that we're moving forward with this appeal is because we're concerned that this is going to affect neighbors up and down these streets into the future. And your decision will set a precedent, I think, for corridor 4 planning in the city. I imagine all of you as city council members have this type of planning guidance in your neighborhoods. And I want you to look at the images on slide 3 and slide 4 and tell me if this is what you have in mind for corridor 4, because it's obtrusive to the neighbors. It will shadow their yards. It's a long, massive wall. The planning guidance in the 24 plan talks about transitions into lower density planning districts. The interior 2 is that district, but instead this is stepping up and higher in massing and bulk. And it just seems inappropriate. We are not, as a neighborhood association, opposed to the number of units, the development itself. We're not a NIMBY neighborhood. It's this particular design. We've been working with the developer since November of last year, and this was the issue that we brought up. It did not get addressed at the Planning Commission Committee of the Whole in December. There's no way for, apparently, for public to provide input. Then the developer got the go-ahead from the Planning Commission Committee of the Whole, and they just continued on with this same design. So I'm hoping as city council members, you will say, no, please tweak this, make it so it doesn't overwhelm the neighbors. So
thank you for your testimony, Mr. Engel. Yep. I'd ask any of the other people who are speaking on the appellant side to sign on and state your name and address for the record. You each have 2 minutes.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me? This is
Max
can. Ellis. Okay, thank you. I am Max Ellis, and I am the president of the South Uptown Neighborhood Association. I will keep it brief as Mr. Engel provided very, very valuable information. We, as he stated, we have been in contact with the developer, and the most immediate item that was discussed and hadn't been addressed is that slope on the back of the building. As you can see, there's 15 feet difference, and we asked for the mass to be pushed to Hennepin. We asked for a different layout for that, and that was never addressed. And we as a neighborhood would support a building that would not be so monolithic towards the back end of the alley, and would give some space and air to the neighborhoods that are on the back side of that street. And also another thing is our concern is for the traffic on a dead end alley that's going to be increased with 74 more cars in that neighborhood. So I will just leave it at that. We would hope that you would be able to see that there's truly 6 stories on the back end that could be pushed to the front. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll see if Julie or Leslie or Ryan or Bruce are on the call and invite them to speak. Is there anyone else who signed up in the public comment queue who would like to speak?
Hi, this is Julie Mitchner. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Super. I did send in some slides. It's not necessarily critical that I just want to make sure that you have them. They don't necessarily need to be broadcast. I'm watching on my television, so I'm a little bit behind. But I am here because I was at a community meeting with 60 other residents of this neighborhood, and 99% of them were not in favor of this project mainly because of this height. We're very interested, I'm here to advocate for new development in the city of Minneapolis. I get that we need more housing. I'm advocating, though, for development that mirrors the essential character of the neighborhood, enhances the use and enjoyment of residents, and is beneficial to the health, safety, and welfare of South Uptown residents. Unfortunately, I just don't think this Landers Group proposed project really rises to that bar. And you can go on to slide number 3. So you can forward on, if you could.
We're on slide 3.
Okay, super. All right, I'm just a little bit behind you. You can go to 4 then. This project, to me, and to the neighborhood, really will alter the essential character of this neighborhood, be injurious to the use and enjoyment of residents who live there, and be detrimental to the health, safety, and welfare of South Uptown residents. I knew that your time is valuable, and I did bring in I did take some photos. I did see that Scott and Aaron showed those photos. So I will go ahead and I will jump to slide, if you want to, please jump to slide number 12. And I can get to some of the real, another big aspect that I don't think has really been brought up and that people really understood at the planning meeting is that the variances and conditional use permits asked in this project are inconsistent with the goals that are outlined in the Minneapolis 2040 plan, particularly as they relate to and it's 92 proposed parking slots in that parking garage for 74 living units. And I provided an attachment, attachment A, for the list of policies and action steps drawn from the 2040 plan that details the consistencies that I found. Next slide. I believe that the 3501 Hennepin Project features 92 parking spaces for 74 units. And this parking structure faces neighbors and is only accessible off of Hennepin via 35th Street, which is an eastbound one-way. Those parking spaces will have one entrance accessible off of a narrow alley because of the fact that they want to build up to the property line, which means that it will be people entering and exiting will be on that one-way city street heading eastbound deeper into the neighborhood where people walk their dogs, jog, bicyclists are around. So undoubtedly when multiple cars are entering and exiting this single lane entrance, cars are going to have to sit there, they're going to have to idle, they're going to back up that short street, they're going to back up onto Hennepin, and traffic congestion is going to increase and create another hazard for pedestrians and bicyclists on Hennepin, not to mention increasing carbon monoxide and winter driving conditions on that street, let me tell you, will make it even worse. I drive it every year. I'm a 30-year resident of Girard Avenue South, and I can tell you it gets pretty narrow and pretty scary. Slide 14 actually shows a mock-up that I did of the close quarters of this entrance. And just for your frame of reference, that's my 2009 Camry. So you can see how narrow that is.
So I'm just going to ask you, you've been going on for like 6 minutes and you're supposed to speak too. So if you could just try to conclude, that would be great.
Yeah, nope, I thank you very much for your time, and you have my materials.
Thank you so much. We'll see if any of the other people who are speaking on the side of the appellant are on the line and would like to say something that we have not already heard. Anyone? There were 3 other people signed up. I'm not sure if you wanted to speak. This is your last chance. Okay, seeing no one else. Is there anyone else?
Hello?
Hello? So is this Leslie?
Can you hear me?
We can. You have 2
Yeah.
minutes, Leslie. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Leslie Plummer. I'm at 3512 Girard, which is directly behind the proposed development. And essentially, I will agree with everyone who has talked so far, and just kind of respect your time. I'm really just focused on the height and bulk of the mammoth wall that will be in my backyard. Just a 70-foot wall that literally and figuratively overshadows not only my property, my neighbor's property, but essentially the South Uptown community as a whole. So my question to you would be, does a 70-foot wall really fit into the community? And ask for some discussion on ways to reconfigure that building to both have less height and then improved radiation from the east. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else on the line who hasn't spoken on the appellant side who would like to speak? Anyone? Okay, we're going to then take the folks who are on the side of the developer, Robert and Tony. I'd ask you specifically to address the question regarding the 70-foot wall in an interior, or in an interior 4, and how you see that meeting the spirit of the 2040 plan.
Great. Madam Chair and committee members, this is Bob Locood from ESG Architects, 500 Washington Avenue South. Can you hear me?
We can, sir.
Great. I did prepare one additional exhibit, and I can begin while we wait for that to come on the screen. It is an exhibit specifically to help the council members and committee members understand the height. So let me know when you can see that.
We can see that.
Okay, great. I'll give just a tiny bit of background on the design process. So it's true, the design of the building hasn't changed very much since we started meeting with the neighborhood group. We first met with the neighborhood group and heard a lot of nice things about the Hennepin Avenue elevation, about the design overall and materials. But from the very first meeting, there was a lot of concern about our choice to locate the mass of the building where we did. And the reason why we did that is because we were trying to focus on the design of Hennepin Avenue and place those 2 courtyards, actually it's 3 small courtyards facing Hennepin Avenue, in an effort to help enliven the pedestrian realm and help create some connection between those courtyards and the street. I do concede that a maybe more conventional massing strategy, for instance, if our goal was to get unanimous or enthusiastic neighborhood support, it probably would have been more expedient to place the majority of the mass toward Hennepin and the step down toward the neighborhood. But we made this choice primarily because we had a desire and a vision to enhance the pedestrian realm on Hennepin Avenue. And so we first presented to the neighborhood group, and that was the feedback we heard. We then immediately presented to the committee of the whole. And I would like to just disagree with Mr. Engel's assertion that the application or drawings didn't clearly show the height against the alley. We knew that the height and bulk of our design would be very crucial toward the approval of this project. So from the very beginning, from that committee of the whole meeting, we strove to create exhibits that very clearly showed the height and bulk of the building that we were proposing. And in fact, all of the exhibits that Mr. Engel showed were included in our land use applications, and most of them were also included in the committee of the whole presentation. So I will just talk about this exhibit. You can see that from the plan, the site plan to the left, which is oriented north, is up in the same orientation as these sections. We chose to create some additional sections just because these exhibits simultaneously show setbacks and height. And so you can see there are 2 section markers cut through that plan on the left. One is through the southernmost courtyard, and that corresponds to the section on the bottom. and the other is cut through the courtyard just north of that, and that is the section on top. So starting with the section on the bottom, that's the portion, cuts through the portion of the building that is south of the dead-end alley. And it's not, maybe it's not clear here, but I know that the committee members have these exhibits so they can maybe use their magnifying glass to look at the dimensions. But I just want to point out that the building, the rear yard, the building complies with the required rear yard setback for the section of the building south of the alley. The building and the balconies and everything are within that required 14-foot setback for a 5-story building. And you can also see there's a solid red line that's kind of ghosted in. That represents the allowable height for a 4-story, 56-foot tall building. Our building is 1 story taller and 3 foot higher. And the reason why it's only 3 feet higher than what's allowed, even though there's an extra story, is that the number of the floor-to-floor height is less than what is allowed. So you can also see this. So this shows the grade differential between Hennepin and the alley. If you zoom in, you can see that at that portion, the grade differential is about 8 feet. It varies, from north to south, but 8 feet at this point. And you can also see its adjacency to the neighboring garage. The section to the upper section is cut through the alley, and you can see that the property line of the development site jogs east where that alley occurs. And so for zoning purposes, the rear yard, required rear yard setback is calculated from where the development property abuts the alley. But you can see that because of the 12-foot width of the alley, the building itself is actually set back, bear with me as I zoom in, the building itself is set back 18 feet from the neighbor's property. So set back actually a little bit more than the portion of the building that south of the alley that complies with the setbacks. And then you can also see comparing the section building with the solid red line, relatively insignificant requests that we're making for height. And then you can also see that the setback of the 5th floor, the top floor, is really quite significant. And I think, is really in response to, making this development fit in with the context. And I think that is all I need to present. And the Tony Kriha from Lander Development Group is here as well. I don't think he plans to present. I'm planning to present for the development team, but we're both available for questions if there are any.
Are there any questions? Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions for the development team? Is there anyone else?
Hello, this is Bruce Cochran. I would like to speak.
Mr. Cochran, which side are you? Are you on the appellant side or are you on the applicant side?
The appellant side. I was not able to get in when you asked me 2 minutes ago. The technology would not let me in.
Okay, well, you have 2 minutes if you'd like to speak now.
Yes, I would. My name is Bruce Cochran. I live with my family at 3520 Girard Avenue South, directly east of the proposed project. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I have 3 points to make. I'll try and get it in 2 minutes. One, it's my understanding the Minneapolis Planning Commission meeting on June 15th was one of the first scheduled distance meetings with the public since the beginning of COVID lockdown. If in fact that was the case, I feel Minneapolis residents were given an experimental and therefore unfair forum to present their comments. The process was overly complex and fraught with technical difficulties. As a result, very few people were able to speak during the public comment period. Rather than try to reschedule the meeting continued without acknowledgement that there may have been more people speaking if the process was more accessible. 2, I work for Minneapolis Public Schools, and we have a saying there, show your work. I'm not convinced all of the members of the Planning Commission visited the site of the new building before they made their decision. It's called a Planning Commission, correct? Several residents, including myself, made offers to committee members to come visit the site to witness. in three-dimensional space the impact this building will have on our neighborhood for generations. We put the time into researching this project, and we request our elected officials to show us some effort to do the same. If you did, we thank you. Point 3, while reporting for the Wedge and the Uptown neighborhood newspapers, I witnessed many of these City Hall meetings in person. What stood out the most about these meetings is how one-sided they feel to voting constituents. It's a sad rerun. The city touts inclusion and equity while encouraging civic engagement. Residents put in the time and effort to research their concerns and form their arguments. They often need to take time, excuse me, out of their working day to engage with city officials about their concerns at these meetings. I'm out of breath because I had to run across the street to try to use Julie's phone to get the technology to work. So just give me a second here. Their comments are taken into account, and then the commission votes. But what is frustrating is not how they vote. We realize they have reasons for the way they vote, and those votes can sometimes be a hard pill to swallow. But what's frustrating is that they vote in silence. They rarely give reasons to the public for why they vote the way they do. If the city claims that they want us to continue to be engaged, and civic leaders should equal our commitment and honor us by giving us the arguments that you use to vote the way you do. Otherwise, in a vacuum, all we can do is create our own reasons and hearsay about their voting decisions. Rather, please leverage your platform and seize the opportunity to teach us about your side of the issues. So I call on the city of Minneapolis to take the next step to transparency about why you vote the way you do, or stop wasting our time by paying lip service to inclusion and engagement while failing to do so yourselves, because we're done speaking to a blank wall. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else who has signed up who hasn't had an opportunity to speak who would like to speak? Anyone? Anyone? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing, and I'll open this up to members of the committee. Is there anyone on the committee who would like to make a motion? Otherwise, I'm going to make a motion and it probably won't pass. But so I'm going to move to grant the appeal. And I have a fairly significant reason for doing so, and that is that I don't believe that a 6-story building adjacent to single-family homes is consistent with what our intent was in the 2040 plan. I do think it's a beautiful project, and I have to think about what it would look like in my part of town. And in part of the area that I represent on South Hennepin, it might make sense to have a building that was 4, 5, maybe even 6 stories, because behind Hennepin Avenue is a lot of multifamily 3- and 4-story buildings. So that might make sense in the part of Uptown that I represent, but clearly here the single family homes abut a building that is towering over them. And when I did ask the applicant to speak to whether or why that was, they essentially said, yeah, well, we cared about Hennepin, not about Girard. So that kind of summed up the developer's point of view. And I appreciate that the developer cares about Hennepin. And like I said, I think it's a really beautiful building. And I love the way that they design the bump outs, but it does basically really impact the people who live adjacent, including the one home that's on 35th. And I have a level of empathy for that. And I feel like that there is a design that could be done that was less impactful. Some people might say 6 stories, 4 stories, what's the difference? It's not a single family house. But I mean, there are ways to mitigate the impact of that large wall and that level of height. So I suspect I won't be on the prevailing side, but since no one else wanted to speak, I'm going to go ahead and do what one of the people who testified did, which was to give my point of view. Is there anyone else who would like to say something about this? Oh, thank you. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Goodman. I was a little bit slow on the draw, but as you suspected, I am not going to support the motion that you offered. I actually, as I look at this, I think what we're really thinking about is the height that's offered from Hennepin seems reasonable, and I think that while we probably could have accommodated a little more of a step down or a little more of a setback, I think at the end of the day, that height was still going to be what happened and was approvable. And so I think that the sense of light being blocked, I think sometimes the hard part about this job is us telling people that you own the property you own and not the property next to you, and sometimes things get built that do have an impact on views and light at some times of day. And I think that would probably happen regardless of what the design ended up being. I think it probably could have been stepped back a little more, but I think that the gains that they show in terms of, and I think that staff recommended in terms of the benefits on Hennepin Avenue seem extensive. I think there's actually some pretty significant benefit to this project. So I didn't quite jump in quickly enough to move denial, but I will vote that way and get the conversation started on that ground.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak on this issue? I will note, Councilmember Fletcher, this is really not a question of views. View would be like something in our world where you're looking out at a skyline view or a riverfront view. This is really a question of a wall right up to the alley, basically, behind these people's homes, and it didn't need to be that way. And I'm empathetic to that. So if no one else wants to speak, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on my motion to grant the appeal.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
No.
Fletcher. No. Ellison.
No.
Schrader.
No.
Chair Goodman.
Aye.
There are 2 ayes and 4 nays.
So that motion fails. Is there a motion anyone else would like to bring? Councilmember Schrader.
Sure, I'll move to deny the appeal.
Are there further comments with regard to Councilmember Schrader's motion? I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Chair Goodman.
No.
There are 5 ayes, 1 nay.
That motion passes. Our last item is item number 14, which is a number of rezoning applications submitted by Tony Kahara for the properties that we just discussed related to the appeal we just addressed. I would ask if there's, I don't believe a staff report is required. Let me see if there's anyone on the committee who would like a staff report. Seeing none, this is not a public hearing, so I am going to move the approval of item number 14. Are there any further comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on item number 14.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Chair Goodman.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
That motion carries and those applications are approved. Seeing no further business before us and without objection, I'll declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you all for being here today.